she cried over a broken teddy bear. A millionaire's kindness changed everything. On a chilly morning, little Emma, only 7 years old, walked slowly down the narrow street toward her school, her small hands clutching an old teddy bear tightly against her chest. The bear was no longer new, its fur faded and matted, one of its button eyes dangling by a thread, and its right ear half torn from years of wear. A patch of white stuffing peeked out from a seam near its belly, but to Emma it was not ugly, it was beautiful, because it carried the memory of her late father. It was the last gift he had given her on her 5th birthday, just before he left this world, and ever since, it had been her comfort on nights she cried herself to sleep, her listener when she whispered her little secrets, and her shield against loneliness. She walked with her head down, her scuffed shoes dragging lightly on the cold pavement, hoping the children rushing past her wouldn't notice the teddy tucked in her arms. But toys have a way of drawing eyes, and soon enough, as she stepped onto the schoolyard, a group of children spotted the worn bear, and their curious stares turned sharp. One of the older boys pointed, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at her dirty, broken bear!" Another child joined in with a laugh that cut through Emma's chest like a knife. "It looks like trash!" A ripple of cruel giggles spread through the group, and before Emma could move, she felt the heat rush to her cheeks. Her lips quivered, her throat tightened, and she hugged the teddy tighter, pressing its head into her chest, as if the bear could somehow shield both of them from the sting of their words. "Why don't you just throw it away?" a girl taunted, her tone dripping with mockery. Emma wanted to shout back, to tell them this was not just a toy, but a piece of her father's love, but her voice failed her. You were trapped behind the lump in her throat. The jeers grew louder. "She's so poor she can't even get a new toy," another boy said, and the group burst into laughter again, each sound echoing inside her ears, each word heavier than the last. Her legs trembled and her heart beat painfully fast, but she couldn't run. Not yet. Tears pooled in her eyes, blurring her vision, and she blinked furiously, desperate to hold them back. One of the boys reached forward, stretching out his hand as if to grab the teddy from her. Fear jolted her awake, and she pulled back sharply, crying out, "Don't touch him!" Her small voice cracked, raw with desperation, but instead of stopping them, it only made the children laugh louder. To them, it was just a dirty old stuffed animal. But to Emma, it was the only thing left that still carried the warmth of her father's embrace. Turning away quickly, she pushed through the circle of laughter, her tears finally spilling down her cheeks as she hurried across the yard. The sound of their voices chased her, ringing in her ears like a cruel song that refused to fade. She reached the far corner of the playground and sat down on the cold curb, her little body curling in on itself as she hugged the teddy tighter than ever. She buried her face in its worn fur, muffling her sobs, whispering broken words only the teddy could hear. "They don't understand," she told it softly, her breath shaking. "You're all I have left of Daddy." She traced the frayed seam with her fingertip, remembering the day her father's voice had told her, "Take care of him, Emma. He'll always keep you company." The memory cracked her heart open, and her tears fell harder, dripping onto the teddy's faded fur. She wished more than anything she could hear his voice again, just once, to remind her she wasn't alone. Around her, the playground was alive with shouts, laughter, and the sound of running feet, but she felt invisible, like a shadow no one cared to see. The children who had mocked her moved on with their games, their cruel entertainment forgotten. But Emma's heart remained heavy, the wound still raw. She pressed her cheek against the bear's torn ear, the scent of old fabric mixed with salt from her tears, grounding her in both pain and comfort. Her shoulders trembled as she rocked slightly, whispering to her bear, promising she would never let go. The school bell rang in the distance, calling the children inside, their footsteps scattering like raindrops, yet Emma stayed seated, unable to face another round of whispers and laughter. She wiped her cheeks roughly with her sleeve, leaving streaks across her soft skin, but she did not care. She lifted the teddy to her lips, kissing its worn ear tenderly, and whispered, "It's okay, Teddy. I still love you." The playground grew quieter, but inside Emma's heart the ache remained, heavy and unshakable. Still, as she clung to the old bear, she reminded herself that no matter how cruel the world became, no matter how much laughter mocked her, she still had one thing that was hers alone: her father's love, stitched into every thread of that broken, precious Teddy. As the playground slowly emptied and Emma remained curled up with her Teddy, a sleek black car came to a quiet stop near the corner of the schoolyard, its engine humming low against the stillness of the morning. Inside sat Alexander Hayes, a man known to the world for his wealth, his sharp suits, and his ability to close deals worth millions. Yet in this moment, none of that mattered, for his eyes had fallen upon the sight of a little girl sitting alone on the curb, her tiny frame trembling as she buried her face into a worn-out teddy bear. He had not meant to stop. In fact, his day was planned down to the last second with meetings, phone calls, and appointments that demanded his attention, but something about the way her shoulders shook, something about the loneliness that wrapped around her small figure like a cold shadow, pierced him in a place he thought he had long buried. He loosened his grip on the steering wheel, his chest tightening as a memory flashed before him. His own childhood, the nights he had sat alone in a dark room after his father left, clutching nothing but silence, his cries ignored by a world that seemed too busy to notice. He blinked, shaking his head, trying to dismiss the ache rising inside, yet his eyes remained fixed on her, and the whisper inside him grew louder. "Don't drive away." He swallowed hard, debating with himself, wondering why this mattered, why out of all the countless faces he passed every day, this one little girl felt different. The polished leather interior of his car contrasted sharply with the raw, fragile image before him, a child with no armor against the cruelty of the world. He leaned back slightly, but the scene outside anchored him, refusing to let him move on. He noticed the way she pressed her cheek against the bear, as if it were the last safe place she knew, and in that small gesture he saw a reflection of the boy he once was, desperate for comfort, desperate for someone to see him. His throat tightened, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt his carefully built walls crack. The voice inside him whispered again, this time firmer, as though it carried the weight of destiny. "Don't leave her like the world once left you." He glanced at the dashboard clock, his schedule already calling, yet his hand refused to shift the gear. Instead, he rolled the window down slightly, letting the crisp air in, letting the sounds of the schoolyard fade, and all he could hear was the soft, muffled sobs of a child who believed she was invisible. The sight rooted him to the moment, tugging at a part of his soul he thought money had long silenced. He tapped his fingers lightly against the steering wheel, each tap echoing the conflict inside him. Logic urging him forward, humanity urging him to stay. His gaze softened as he studied her small figure, her tiny arms wrapped protectively around the stuffed bear. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt something unfamiliar. An ache not for himself, but for another. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as if trying to memorize every detail of this fragile scene, knowing somehow that if he left now, the image of her tears would follow him for the rest of his life. His chest rose with a deep, unsteady breath, the weight of decision heavy upon him. He had always been a man who chased profits, deadlines, and contracts, but now, sitting in that quiet car, staring at a broken-hearted child, he realized life was offering him something far more important: the chance to be human again. The whisper returned, stronger, undeniable. "Don't drive away." Alexander sat in the car for a moment longer, the whisper in his chest refusing to fade, until finally he opened the door and stepped out, the cool air brushing against his face as his polished shoes touched the pavement. Each step he took toward the little girl felt heavier than any boardroom walk, as though he were stepping into a part of life he had avoided for too long. He moved slowly, careful not to startle her, his eyes softening as he saw how tightly she clung to the ragged teddy, her small shoulders still trembling with silent sobs. Clearing his throat gently, he crouched down a few feet away so he wouldn't tower over her, and in a voice far gentler than the one he used in meetings, he asked, "Hey, sweetheart, why are you crying?" The sound of his voice made Emma flinch at first, her tear-streaked face lifting just enough to reveal wide, frightened eyes that weren't used to kindness from strangers. For a moment she said nothing, her lips trembling as if deciding whether to stay silent. But then her gaze drifted down to the teddy in her arms, and the words spilled out in a broken whisper. "They laughed at my teddy, but it's all I have. It was my daddy's gift, before he went to heaven." The world seemed to still at her words, the schoolyard noise fading as Alexander felt the sentence strike him like a thunderbolt, splitting through the walls he had built around his heart. His chest tightened, his throat burned, and before he knew it, he was kneeling down fully in front of her, lowering himself to her fragile world. He looked at the bear more closely now, the torn stitches, the dangling eye, the stuffing poking out, and suddenly it was no longer just a broken toy. It was a symbol of love, of memory, of a bond stronger than time itself. Swallowing hard, he forced back the lump rising in his throat and spoke softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Your daddy must have loved you very much. That teddy isn't broken. It's special. And so are you." Emma blinked at him, her tears pausing for the first time, as though she couldn't believe someone would say such words. No one had ever defended her teddy before. No one had ever seen what she saw when she held it. Her small hands loosened just slightly from their desperate grip, as if allowing his words to settle into her heart. A faint warmth spread across her face, not a smile yet, but the fragile beginning of trust. She studied the man kneeling in front of her, his expensive suit and polished shoes out of place in her world, yet his eyes carried a sadness she recognized. For the first time, Emma felt that someone truly understood her pain, that maybe she wasn't as invisible as she had believed. Alexander, on the other hand, felt an ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, and in that moment he knew he wasn't looking at just a little girl with a broken teddy, but at a soul reaching for kindness, the same way he once had when the world had turned its back on him. That night, after leaving the schoolyard with Emma's words still echoing in his heart, Alexander found himself unable to sleep, pacing the wide, empty halls of his grand home, the silence pressing heavily against him as he thought about the little girl with the broken teddy. He had attended countless business dinners and signed contracts worth fortunes, yet nothing lingered in his mind like the image of her small arms clutching that torn bear as though her life depended on it. By morning, he made a decision that surprised even himself, and instead of heading straight to his office, he drove to a modest neighborhood on the edge of town, guided by the address he had quietly asked about. The houses here were small and weathered, their paint fading, their porches sagging slightly with age, so different from the luxury he lived in. He parked his car at the side of the road and stepped out, carrying a carefully wrapped box in his hands, his heart strangely unsteady as he walked up the narrow path to Emma's door. When he knocked gently, the door creaked open to reveal Emma's mother, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, her hair pulled back hastily as though rest had been a stranger for a long time. She froze for a moment at the sight of the well-dressed man on her doorstep, suspicion flickering across her tired face, but Alexander's voice was warm and steady when he said, "Good morning, ma'am. I met your daughter yesterday. My name is Alexander Hayes." She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the doorframe, but when she heard Emma's quick footsteps and saw her daughter's eyes light up at the sight of him, her expression softened. "Please, come in," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him into the small, modest living room where the worn furniture and faded curtains told a story of struggle and sacrifice. Emma ran to him with wide eyes, still clutching her old teddy, and he knelt down to her level with a smile that was gentler than the one he ever showed in the world of business. "I have something for you," he said, holding out the box. Emma's little hands trembled as she peeled back the wrapping, her breath catching when she lifted the lid to reveal the softest, most beautiful teddy bear she had ever seen. Its fur was smooth and warm to the touch, its eyes shining with kindness, and stitched carefully along one paw was her name. Emma. She gasped softly, hugging it to her chest with wonder. But what melted her heart most was not the gift itself. It was the words Alexander spoke next, his tone filled with sincerity. "Your old teddy is still your treasure," he told her gently, nodding toward the worn bear she still held tightly in her other arm. "This one is just a reminder that you are never alone." Emma's lips parted, her throat tightening with emotion, and then, without hesitation, she flung her small arms around his neck, squeezing him as tightly as her little body could. Alexander felt the hug in the depths of his chest, a warmth spreading through him as her gratitude poured out wordlessly. Her mother watched from the doorway, her hand covering her mouth as tears shimmered in her tired eyes, moved not just by the gift, but by the tenderness this stranger had shown her daughter. In that tiny room, surrounded by worn furniture and quiet sacrifice, Alexander felt a fulfillment deeper than any wealth had ever given him, and for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to believe that kindness could change not only the life of a child, but also the heart of a man who thought he had nothing left to give. In the days that followed, Alexander found himself returning again and again to the little house on the quiet street, each visit drawing him further from the cold routines of wealth and deeper into a warmth he hadn't felt in years. At first, he kept his gestures small, never wanting to overwhelm Emma or her mother, quietly leaving envelopes at the door to cover school fees, arranging for fresh groceries to arrive without announcement, or ensuring the electricity bill was always paid before it could cause worry. He never spoke of it directly, preferring instead to sit with Emma on the worn couch in the evenings, listening to her chatter about her school day while she hugged her new teddy, the old one always nearby, as though guarding her heart. He read bedtime stories when her mother's tired eyes begged for rest, his deep voice filling the small room with fairy tales that made Emma giggle and yawn until she drifted off, her tiny hand resting trustingly on his sleeve. Slowly, the walls of formality that had always surrounded Alexander began to crumble, replaced by a simple routine of laughter, dinners shared at the small wooden table, and the sound of a child's footsteps running to greet him at the door. What began as kindness grew into something deeper, something he could no longer ignore. He was becoming a part of her world, and she was becoming a part of his heart. One quiet evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange behind the cracked windows, Emma climbed into his lap, her tiny arms circling his neck as she leaned close. Her voice was a whisper, trembling yet sure, when she said, "You're like the daddy I prayed for." The words sank into him with a force stronger than any business victory he had ever known, and his vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He swallowed hard, unable to speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the purity of her trust and the enormity of her love. All the riches he had gathered, the houses, the cars, the investments, they had never made him feel this way, never filled the emptiness that had followed him since his own childhood. Yet here, in the arms of a little girl who saw him not for his wealth but for his heart, he finally felt rich in a way that money could never measure. He pressed his cheek against her hair, closing his eyes as he let a tear slip free, silently promising that he would never let her down, never let her feel the loneliness he once knew. In that moment, Alexander Hayes, the man the world knew as a millionaire, understood the truth he had been searching for all his life. Love, pure and unasked for, was the greatest treasure of all, and Emma had given it to him freely. The years slipped by faster than either of them expected, each season weaving new memories into the fabric of their lives until the once fragile little girl grew into a young woman whose spirit carried both resilience and grace. Alexander, who had once walked alone through halls of silence, now found his days filled with the warmth of Emma's laughter, her milestones becoming his own victories, her joys mending pieces of his heart he never thought would heal. On the day of her high school graduation, the auditorium glowed with celebration, families filling the rows with cameras, flowers, and proud smiles. Yet for Alexander, sitting beside Emma's mother, it was more than just a ceremony. It was the proof that his choice years ago had blossomed into something greater than he could have imagined. As Emma walked across the stage in her flowing gown, her cap balanced slightly crooked on her head, she carried not one but two teddy bears pressed carefully in her hands, the worn, torn one that held her father's memory, and the newer one that held Alexander's promise. The sight of both together, symbols of past love and present kindness, drew a hush of emotion from those who noticed. But for Alexander, it was like watching her carry the story of her entire life in her arms. When her name was called and she stepped forward to the podium to give her speech, she paused, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on the two faces that meant the world. Her mother, tears glistening, and Alexander, his hands clasped tightly as though holding back the wave of emotions inside him. Taking a breath, Emma's voice rang clear, steady, despite the weight of the moment. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change a life forever. I know, because a millionaire once saw me crying over a broken teddy bear, and instead of walking away, he chose to stay. The words fell into the silence of the room, touching every soul present. And then the applause erupted, echoing like thunder against the high ceilings, people rising to their feet in admiration, not only for her achievement, but for the truth in her story. Alexander felt his chest tighten as tears blurred his vision, his hand lifting to wipe one away quickly, though he no longer cared if anyone saw. He thought of that first moment on the curb outside the school, of the whisper that had told him not to drive away, and he realized that choice had led him here, to this radiant young woman who looked at him with gratitude and love that no wealth could ever buy. Pride swelled inside him, not the pride of success or fortune, but the pride of having given his heart where it was most needed, of knowing his kindness had built not just opportunities, but a future, a hope, a sense of belonging for a girl who once believed she was invisible. As the applause roared around him, Alexander Hayes sat quietly in his seat, tears rolling freely now, humbled by the truth that his greatest legacy was not his businesses or his fortune, but the life of a girl who had taught him what it meant to be truly rich.